McKay's Used Books on Broadway in Knoxville. Saturday morning, late September. 3 years ago, give or take. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. That's the honest truth of it. When you're retired and the weeks stop having the shape that work gave them, the bell schedules, the grading stacks, the 35 years of the same hallway on the first day of school, you find yourself moving through places you have no urgent reason to be. McKay's was one of mine. Floor-to-ceiling shelves, the smell of 10,000 books that someone else once needed, coffee going cold in a paper cup I was carrying for no particular reason. I had no plan for the theology section. I can't tell you why I stopped there. I was just moving through the aisles. There was a book on the bottom shelf. Spine cracked. The dust jacket had faded to that particular shade of yellow that means it had been sitting there long enough to forget why it was there. Abraham Joshua Heschel, God in Search of Man. A Philosophy of Judaism. Published 1955. $3.50, penciled in faint numbers inside the front cover. I opened it somewhere in the middle. Not to a particular page. I wasn't looking for anything. And I read this. There is the man who fears the Lord, lest he be punished in his body, family, or possessions, and another man who fears the Lord because he is afraid of punishment in the life to come. Both types are considered inferior in Jewish tradition. I stood in that aisle for a long time, because in 52 years of Southern Baptist faith, 22 years as a deacon, 35 years teaching Sunday school, more sermons than I could count on Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7. No one had ever told me that what I had been doing, the specific emotional response I had been trained to produce in the presence of God, the fear that had lived in my chest like a quiet tenant since I was 6 years old. No one had told me that the tradition that wrote the book considered it the inferior form, the lowest grade of the relationship. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of investigation that matters to you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I want to be direct about why. The YouTube algorithm does not naturally surface this kind of careful, slow research. It surfaces what gets clicks quickly, not what takes 2 years to trace properly. The only way I can keep doing this work, spending weeks in the sources, tracking the specific decisions that changed what you were taught, is if this channel keeps growing. The subscribe button costs you nothing. For what I'm trying to do here, it means everything. Let me tell you what I was taught about the fear of God. Not abstractly. I mean in concrete, specific terms. The way it was delivered to me across 5 decades of Southern Baptist formation in East Tennessee. Proverbs 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That verse was the first thing I memorized in Sunday school. It was on the banner above the classroom door. Dark blue fabric, gold lettering. The kind of banner you stare at when the lesson is going long. It was embroidered on the pillow my grandmother kept on her bed until she died. It was quoted in sermons the way a foundation stone is referenced, not with explanation, not with the history of how the verse got to us, not with any examination of what the original language actually said, but with the bedrock certainty that this is load-bearing and everyone already understands what it holds up. The fear, not the love, not the trust, not the wonder, the fear. And I want to be precise about what that meant in practice, because the abstraction lets people off the hook. What it meant in practice, in the experience of the child I was and the man I grew into over 50 years, was this. There is an omniscient God who sees every thought you have, who is keeping a record, and who has the inclination and the power to punish you for transgression. Not theoretically, not in some abstract afterlife. In your body, in your family, in the things you love, now. I did not lie as a child primarily because lying was wrong. I did not lie because I was afraid. I did not have bad thoughts. Or I tried not to, which is the same ongoing torture, because I believed something was watching my thinking in real time. Not reading my diary, watching my thinking. Before I had finished forming a thought that might displease it, the surveillance was already underway. I fasted in secret. I made elaborate bargains in the night. I repeated prayers until they felt safe enough to stop. I would wake up at 2 a.m. convinced I had committed some spiritual infraction during a dream, and I would lie there going over my thoughts, trying to find what needed to be confessed before morning. I was told this was a healthy relationship with God. I was told this was the beginning of wisdom. Nobody told me it was the inferior form. Nobody told me the tradition that wrote that verse understood it differently from how it was being preached to me. Nobody told me there was a word for what I was actually supposed to feel. And it wasn't the word they had given me. Now here's what I need to tell you about the Hebrew language. Not as a linguist. I was a history teacher. Not a biblical scholar, but as someone who spent 2 years after my faith began to unravel, going back to the primary sources with the same discipline I spent 35 years teaching high school students to apply to historical documents. Verify the source, check the original language, follow the evidence back as far as it goes. Hebrew has other words for terror. This is not interpretation. This is not one academic school pushing against another. This is vocabulary, the simple, documented, uncontested fact of what words exist in the Hebrew language and what they mean. It is sitting in the concordances. It is in Strong's, which has been available to seminaries and curious laypeople for over 150 years. The first word is EIMAH. Aleph Yod Mem He. The definition is specific. Dread, primal horror. The physiological terror that precedes thought. The kind of fear that is in the body before it reaches the mind. The cold sweat, the emptied stomach, the tunnel vision of the nervous system detecting something that might unmake you. The Hebrew Bible uses EIMAH in Genesis 15, verse 12. This is the night God appears to Abraham in the deep darkness. The text records that a great and terrifying darkness came over Abraham. And that word, the primal somatic horror of suddenly finding yourself in the presence of something that exceeds every category you have. That word is EIMAH. The second word is PACHAD. Pe-chet-dalet. Sudden panic. The fright that overtakes you without warning. Adrenaline that overrides cognition. Job uses it in chapter 3, verse 25. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. The King James renders this, the thing which I greatly feared. That is PACHAD, the anticipatory dread that becomes its own kind of paralysis. Both of these words existed, documented and available in the Hebrew vocabulary when the authors of Proverbs sat down to write their book. They knew EIMAH. They knew PACHAD. When they wrote the first verse of the first chapter of wisdom literature, the verse that would be copied and transmitted and memorized and embroidered on pillows for 3,000 years, they reached into the vocabulary of their language. They did not choose EIMAH, they did not choose PACHAD, they chose yirah, and that single, deliberate, vocabulary decision is the investigation. Yirah, Yod Resh Aleph He. I want you to understand what this word contains, because the English word fear does not hold it. English fear points in one direction: threat, dread, the anticipation of harm. That's the full range. There's nowhere else to go inside the word. Yirah points in 2 directions simultaneously. Yes, the word encompasses terror. It can describe what you might feel in the presence of genuine danger, but it also, fully, legitimately, and by the documented intention of the Hebrew writers, describes awe, wonder, reverence, the sense of standing before something so vast and beautiful and incomprehensible that you feel yourself correctly sized in relation to it, not crushed, not eliminated, made the right size by the encounter. Dr. Eitan Bar, a Hebrew language scholar who has published careful work on this specific word's usage across the Hebrew scriptures, describes yirah as experiencing something that surpasses one's abilities and comprehension, a response that draws one into the presence, not away from it. Draws you in. If you've spent any time in a Christian church that preached the fear of God, I need you to feel how different that is from what you were taught. EIMAH drives you away. It is a primal flight response, your nervous system computing threat and moving you toward an exit. Yirah, in its full original range, as the wisdom writers who chose it understood it, was supposed to move you toward. It was supposed to be the emotional response that drew you deeper into relationship, deeper into wisdom, deeper into whatever encounter with the infinite you were capable of sustaining. This is why the tradition described it as the beginning of wisdom. Not the end, not the submission. The beginning, the first movement of a mind that has encountered something larger than itself and, rather than fleeing, has turned to look. Abraham Joshua Heschel, writing in 1955 from his Jewish theological tradition, the tradition that produced Proverbs, the tradition that had been reading yirah in its original language for 3,000 years, gave this state of mind a name. He called it radical amazement. Awe, Heschel wrote, is not the same as fear. Fear is the anticipation of evil or pain. Awe is the sense of wonder and humility inspired by the sublime, the feeling we experience when confronting something greater than ourselves. Radical amazement, the state of being arrested by something that exceeds your ordinary categories and responding not with paralysis, but with a kind of enlarged attention. That is what yirah points toward at its core. That is what the authors of Proverbs put in the text, and that is not what I was taught in Sunday school. So how did a word that means draw near become the architecture of terror? That is the investigation. And the answer is not mysterious. It has names and dates and specific decisions documented in the historical record, traceable step by step. This is what happened. Alexandria, Egypt, approximately 250 to 200 years before Christ. A group of Jewish scholars, 72 translators by tradition, though the number may be idealized, were working in Alexandria under the patronage of Ptolemy II. Their task was to produce a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures for the Jewish diaspora living in the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world. These were Jews who had been outside of Israel for generations, people who read Koine Greek more fluently than the Hebrew of their ancestors. They needed the scriptures in a language they could actually understand. This translation is called the Septuagint, from the Latin word for 70. When these scholars reached yirah, in Proverbs and in the dozens of other places where the word appears, they chose the Greek word phobos, phi omicron beta omicron sigma. Here is what is critical to understand about phobos in the Greek philosophical tradition. It was not a simple terror word. Aristotle analyzed phobos in the Poetics as one of the two emotions produced by tragedy. The overwhelming sense of dread and awe that overtakes you when you encounter something that exceeds your ordinary categories. The Stoics discussed phobos as a response to the sublime, the vertigo of standing before something incomprehensibly large. In the culture where the Septuagint was being produced, in the intellectual air of Alexandria in the 3rd century before Christ, phobos carried a spectrum. It could mean fear, it could mean awe, it could mean the complex mixed response of a human being encountering something that is simultaneously beautiful and overwhelming, drawing and threatening. The Septuagint translators chose well. They found a Greek word that held, like the Hebrew yirah, the full range, terror on one end, awe on the other, the spectrum preserved. That was 250 years before Christ. The awe was still there. But then something happened. Bethlehem and Rome. Between the years 382 and 405 of the Common Era, Sophronius Eusebius Hieronymus, Jerome, was the most formidable biblical linguist of late antiquity. He knew classical Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. He had studied under rabbis in Bethlehem, sitting in actual conversation with men who had been reading yirah in its original language for generations. He had translated enormous sections of the Old Testament directly from the Hebrew, not just from the Greek. Pope Damasus I commissioned him to produce what would become the authoritative Latin translation of the Christian scriptures. The project consumed 2 decades of Jerome's life, most of it spent in a cave in Bethlehem. We know this from his letters, which survive, writing by lamplight, arguing in correspondence with Augustine about whether specific choices were correct, producing the text that would be called the Vulgate, Vulgata, the common edition, the Bible for ordinary people. When Jerome reached Phobos in the Septuagint, itself already a translation of yirah, he had choices. Latin has multiple words that could have carried the meaning. Reverentia, reverence, the emotional posture of someone who honors something greater than themselves, with full awareness of the distance, but no sense of threat. Veneratio, veneration, the deep respect that borders on worship, warm rather than cold. Metus, cautious respect, the watchfulness of someone who takes something seriously, closer to solemn than terrified. Jerome chose timor. Timor, the Latin root of timorous, timid, fearful, the apprehension of harm. This is not a neutral choice between equivalent options. Timor does not hold the spectrum that Phobos held. It does not carry the draws you toward dimension of yirah. Jerome took a Hebrew word that looked in 2 directions, terror and awe, passed it through a Greek word that preserved both directions, and then in Latin narrowed it. The awe fell away. What remained in the Latin was the dread, and Jerome's Latin was not just one translation among many. What happened to it next is what locked that choice into place for 5 centuries and beyond. Trento, northern Italy, December 1546. The Council of Trent had been convened by Pope Paul III in response to the Protestant Reformation, to Luther's 95 Theses, to Calvin restructuring the Church from Geneva, to the entire theological and political earthquake that was fracturing Western Christianity. The Catholic Church was in the process of defining, precisely and officially, what it believed and what counted as authoritative. On the 8th of April, 1546, the Council issued a decree. They declared Jerome's Vulgate, his 5th century Latin translation, the official, authentic, and authoritative text of the Scriptures for the Catholic Church. Not the Hebrew original, not the Greek Septuagint, not any translation that returned to the yirah and asked what the authors of Proverbs actually intended when they chose that word over EIMAH and PACHAD. Jerome's timor, elevated to doctrine, made official by the Council of Trent in 1546, 1400 years after the choice was made. What one man chose in a cave in Bethlehem, the Church declared the Word of God in a council chamber in northern Italy. Now here is the part that surprised me most when I traced this, and I want to tell you honestly. I went into this investigation with the assumption that the Protestant Reformation would have fixed it. The Reformers claimed sola scriptura, Scripture alone, back to the original sources, back past the institutional accretions of 15 centuries to the Hebrew and the Greek. If anyone was going to restore yirah's full meaning, I assumed it would be the tradition that produced my tradition. It didn't happen. William Tyndale, who was strangled and burned at the stake in 1536 for the crime of producing an English Bible without ecclesiastical permission, worked with genuine commitment to the Hebrew and Greek texts. His English New Testament of approximately 1534 is remarkable scholarship for its era. He knew Hebrew. He worked directly with the sources. He translated The Fear of the Lord. 47 scholars, assembled by King James I of England, worked from 1604 to 1611 on what would become the King James Bible. These were among the finest biblical scholars in the English-speaking world at the time. They had access to the Hebrew manuscripts, they had access to the rabbinic tradition, they had access to the Septuagint, they had access to the ongoing scholarly discussion in European universities about what yirah actually meant, because that discussion was already happening. They translated, "the fear of the Lord," because by 1611, fear of the Lord was no longer merely a translation. It was the emotional architecture of Western Christian piety. 1,500 years of sermons, 1,500 years of catechisms, hymns, confessionals, spiritual directors, theologians building on theologians, all of it resting on Timor, on Jerome's Latin, on the dread that had been extracted from the spectrum of yirah. To change fear to awe would have been to say, what we have been teaching is not what the text says. And the Council of Trent had just in 1546 declared Jerome's text to be what the text says, so the translators kept the word their world expected. And "the fear of the Lord" became the English phrase that would be memorized by tens of millions of people across 4 centuries, embroidered on pillows, hung above Sunday school doors, repeated in churches across East Tennessee and everywhere else, as though it were simply and obviously and permanently what the original said. It was not. I want to be fair here. I'm not saying that every pastor who ever preached on the fear of God was hiding something they knew. Most of them were not hiding anything. Most of them had been formed in the same tradition I had been formed in, reading the same English translation, being handed the same theological categories without a map back to the Hebrew. But here's what I found when I started paying attention to what was available. Abraham Joshua Heschel published God in Search of Man in 1955, not in an obscure academic journal, in a major press, in a form that was widely reviewed and widely read. The argument that yirah meant radical amazement, not Timor, was not hidden knowledge. It was not locked in a Vatican archive. It was sitting in the religious section of bookstores and in the reference stacks of seminary libraries. The scholarly conversation about yirah's semantic range, the specific awe versus terror distinction, has been an active discussion in academic biblical scholarship for well over a century. The lexicographic evidence is in Strong's Concordance, which any motivated layperson can access. The distinction between yirah, EIMAH, and PACHAD is in introductory-level Old Testament commentaries available to every seminary student. And meanwhile, this is what Marlene Winell, the psychologist who coined the term religious trauma syndrome in 2011, has spent decades documenting. People have been sitting in therapists' offices working through exactly the damage that the terror interpretation produces. The hypervigilance, the sense of being watched by something that is always on the edge of punishment. The intrusive thoughts that feel like sin. The compulsive prayer rituals to ward off divine anger. The somatic anxiety that persists years after the theological framework that created it has been abandoned. Winell identifies fear-based theology, the specific terror interpretation of the relationship with God, as the single most reliable predictor of the kind of post-religious anxiety that doesn't simply resolve when belief ends, because what was installed was not just a belief, it was a nervous system state. It was a physiological response trained by years of being told that God was watching your thinking and that the consequences of a wrong thought were eternal. The scholarship was there. The restoration of the original meaning was possible. The awe was waiting to be recovered. Some of the silence around it was simple ignorance. The tradition had been passing down the English translation so long that few people thought to go back. And some of it was something else. Something like the institutional inertia of a structure that has been built on Timor for 1,500 years and cannot easily afford to announce that the foundation word means something different from what it said. Let me tell you about Abraham Joshua Heschel properly. Not as a footnote. As a person. He was born in Warsaw in 1907, into a Hasidic rabbinic family that traced its lineage back 8 generations through Eastern European Jewish life. He grew up surrounded by the full tradition of yirah as it had been understood in Jewish scholarship for centuries, not as Jerome's Timor, not as the surveillance of a punishing God, but as something the tradition consistently described as drawing you closer to the presence, not driving you from it. In January of 1939, Heschel received a visa to leave Warsaw. He left. His mother, Rivka Reisel, his three sisters, Devorah Miriam, Esther Sima, Gittel, his entire community, the students, the rabbis, the families who had gathered in the study halls and synagogues of Warsaw for generations. Most of them were dead within 3 years. He came to America. He rebuilt his life in Cincinnati, then in New York. He taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary for more than 2 decades. He marched arm in arm with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma in March of 1965, and said afterward that he felt his legs were praying. He opposed the Vietnam War on the same moral grounds he applied to everything: the conviction that human beings are made in the image of something that cannot be reduced, and that this demands from us a response not of cowering but of full engaged attention. In 1955, 10 years after the liberation of the concentration camps, he published God in Search of Man. The argument of that book, the sustained, serious, careful argument for what yirah actually means in the Hebrew wisdom tradition, is not a minor footnote in the 20th century recovery of biblical scholarship. It is one of the most important attempts in the English language to restore what the translation chain from yirah to phobos to timor to fear had taken away. He wrote, "Awe is not the same as fear. Fear is the anticipation of evil or pain. Awe is the sense of wonder and humility inspired by the sublime, the feeling we experience when confronting something greater than ourselves." He wrote, "Wonder rather than doubt is the root of knowledge." He wrote that yirah in its highest Jewish understanding was never the lowest grade dread of punishment that Trent had ratified and the King James translators had passed on. It was the radical amazement of someone who has encountered something uncontainable and been enlarged by the encounter rather than diminished. And then he wrote the sentence I found on a bottom shelf in McKay's on a Saturday in September. "There is the man who fears the Lord, lest he be punished in his body, family, or possessions, and another man who fears the Lord because he is afraid of punishment in the life to come." Both types are considered inferior in Jewish tradition. Inferior, not the deepest form of the relationship, not the beginning of wisdom in the way that word was intended, the lowest grade, the entry-level experience, the child's version, you might say, the version that the tradition expected you to grow out of as wisdom matured. The tradition that produced the Proverbs never intended that its first verse should produce a person who wakes up at 2 a.m, terrified of their own thoughts. That was not what yirah was chosen to describe. That was what Timor produced: Jerome's Timor, Trent's Timor, the King James translators' fear. And the church handed it to millions of people and told them it was the foundation. Here is what I need you to understand with precision, because precision is what this moment requires. The authors of Proverbs, Jewish wisdom writers working in Jerusalem approximately 3,000 years ago in the 10th or 9th century before Christ, had a vocabulary that included EIMAH for primal, somatic, physiological terror, PACHAD for sudden panic and anticipatory dread, and yirah for the vast, two-directional spectrum that includes both terror and awe. They were not careless with language. The wisdom tradition was precise. These writers spent their lives with words, weighing them, choosing them, considering which ones carried the right weight for what they were trying to describe. When they composed the line that would become Proverbs 1, verse 7, the first principle of the entire tradition of wisdom, they chose yirah, not EIMAH, not PACHAD. Both were available. Both were used elsewhere in the scriptures when terror was what the text meant. Neither of them was chosen here. The authors of Proverbs chose the word that looks both ways, toward fear and toward awe, because they understood the beginning of wisdom as the kind of encounter that could be either one, depending on how you met it. And their tradition consistently understood the higher form to be the awe, the draw, the radical amazement that makes you more fully yourself rather than less. What Jerome produced in 405 AD was a 5th century Latin interpretation of the word. Not a translation of the original, but a translation of a translation, with a word choice that eliminated 1/2 of the spectrum. What the Council of Trent produced in 1546 was a 16th century decree elevating that interpretation to official doctrine, not a return to the source, but a ratification of the narrowing. What the King James translators produced in 1611 was a 17th century English rendering of a 5th century Latin rendering of a 3rd century BC Greek rendering of a 10th century BC Hebrew original, and at each step, the word got smaller. 4 translations, nearly 2,000 years of drift. And what arrived in the Sunday school classroom where I memorized that verse, what arrived in your church, in however you received it, was not what the authors of Proverbs put in the text. What they put in the text was yirah, the word that draws you in. What was delivered to you was timor, the word that keeps you afraid. The church did not teach you what the Hebrew said. The church taught you what Jerome chose in a cave in Bethlehem in the 5th century AD. I want to close with something Baruch Spinoza wrote in 1670. In the preface to the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, he published it anonymously in Amsterdam, without his name on the cover, because the last person in Amsterdam who had written something that directly about the mechanism of religious authority had been found dead in a canal, and Spinoza understood that some observations require a degree of self-protection. He was writing about superstition, about the specific relationship between fear and religious adherence. He wrote that superstition takes its rise, maintains itself, and is fostered by fear. That the person governed by fear in their relationship with God does not love God. They flee punishment. Their obedience is not the response of someone drawn into presence. It is the compliance of someone who has been given no other choice. And he wrote that a religion built on this mechanism does not produce wisdom. It produces servility. It produces people who mistake terror for faith, who confuse the lowest grade of the relationship with the highest. Spinoza published this in 1670. He did not have the full lexicographic apparatus available to us today. He could not trace the specific chain from yirah to phobos to timor to fear with the documentary precision we can bring to it now. He did not know about Strong's Concordance, which would be published 2 centuries later. He had not read Heschel, who would not be born for another 237 years. But he identified the mechanism exactly. When the primary relationship between a person and their God is driven by fear of punishment, when timor, not yirah in its fullest sense, is the organizing emotion of the faith, you have not built a tradition of wisdom. You have installed a fear response. You have produced obedience by threat rather than transformation by encounter. In Chapter 1 of the Tractatus, Spinoza examines how prophets communicated the divine, and he notes that the ordinary understanding of God, the understanding that governed most of the faithful, was shaped by imagination rather than reason, by the images that language produced in the mind rather than by direct comprehension. He identified that when language described God as wrathful, as surveilling, as ready to punish, it formed in the minds of the faithful an imagination of God as threat, not as the source of radical amazement, as the source of dread. The translation choice Jerome made, timor, was precisely the kind of language Spinoza identified as producing that imagination. And Heschel, writing from the tradition that had never made that translation choice, from the tradition that had kept reading yirah in its original Hebrew and understood it as the draw that begins wisdom rather than the dread that enforces compliance. Heschel gives us what Spinoza's analysis points toward without quite delivering. If yirah is the beginning of wisdom, and yirah means radical amazement, then wisdom begins with the moment you stand before something incomprehensibly vast, and rather than fleeing, you turn toward it with your full attention. That is a different kind of faith than the one Jerome built in Latin. That is a different kind of person than the one who wakes at 2 a.m. trying to inventory his thoughts for sin. The original Hebrew was an invitation. The translation produced an institution. That Saturday afternoon in September, after McKay's, I drove home on Broadway, across the bridge over First Creek, past the church where I had served as a deacon for 22 years. The parking lot was empty. It was afternoon, the building locked up. The marquee with the week's verse already changed to something I didn't read. I didn't stop. I sat at my kitchen table and read Heschel for the rest of the afternoon. I turned the pages slowly, the way you do when you're reading something that keeps requiring you to put the book down and look at the wall for a while. What I was feeling, I want to be honest about this, was not simple. It wasn't triumph. I had already spent enough years deconstructing to be past the feeling of triumph at each new piece of evidence. It wasn't anger either, though there had been a lot of anger earlier in the process, and some of it had been appropriate. It was something more like grief that was slowly becoming something else. Here is the grief part, the theology I had been handed, the one built on Timor, on surveillance, on the constant low-grade dread of a God who watched your thinking and kept a record. That theology had been presented to me as the truth of the Hebrew Scriptures, as what the text actually said, as the original intention of men who had been sitting under olive trees in Jerusalem 3,000 years ago trying to describe the first principle of wisdom. And what Heschel was telling me, what the Hebrew lexicon confirms, what any scholar who has actually followed yirah through its contexts will tell you, is that those men had made a specific word choice. They had access to EIMAH. They had access to PACHAD. They chose yirah. They chose the word that draws you in. And somewhere between the scribes writing in 9th century Jerusalem and the Sunday school classroom where I memorized that verse in 1968, somewhere in the distance between yirah and Timor, between radical amazement and fear of punishment, the draw had become a dread, not by the intention of the original, by the accumulation of translation choices made across 2,000 years by people who, for a variety of reasons, found Timor more useful than reverentia. And here is the other thing, the part that was not quite grief, the part that I still don't entirely have a name for. I thought, what if the word had stayed? What if what had been handed to me that first Sunday school morning was not the inferior form dressed up as the foundation, but the original? What if someone had said, the beginning of wisdom is radical amazement, the awe that draws you in, the response that makes you more fully yourself in the presence of something larger than yourself? What would 50 years have been shaped like? I don't know. I genuinely do not know. That is not a question I can answer, and I've learned to be suspicious of the versions of it that feel like answers. But I know what I felt that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with Heschel's book and the light coming through the window at the angle it gets in September in East Tennessee. I felt something move in my chest that had not moved in a long time. Something like the beginning of a different relationship with the question, not with the faith I had lost, not with the church that had formed me, with the question itself, the question the Hebrew original was actually asking before Jerome translated it, before Trent ratified the translation, before the King James scholars locked it into the English that found its way to me. What would it feel like to stand before something incomprehensibly vast and be drawn toward it rather than driven from it? I held the book for a while before I paid attention to the time. Before I sign off, I want to say something directly about what I just walked you through. This took me the better part of 2 years to piece together properly. The Hebrew lexicon entries, verified across 3 different concordances. Jerome's correspondence with Pope Damasus. It's in the historical record. Several of his letters survive. The specific texts from the Council of Trent. The translation history of the Septuagint. Heschel's book and the scholarship that preceded and followed it. The way these specific pieces connect into a chain that can be traced, step by step, from Proverbs 1, verse 7 in 9th century BC Jerusalem to what was taught to you in your church. A retired history teacher with enough time and not enough distractions can do this kind of research. A YouTube algorithm does not naturally surface the results of it. This channel exists in a small corner of YouTube that has to be deliberately sought out, and the only way it keeps existing is if the people who find it and find it valuable find some way to say so. If this investigation named something for you, if it gave language to something you've been carrying without knowing what it was, there is a super thanks button below this video. I'm not going to make an elaborate case for it. I just want to say that you are not simply a consumer of this content. You are part of the reason this channel is possible. And knowing that somebody found the work valuable is, genuinely, what makes it sustainable. And here is the question I want to leave you with. If you grew up in a church that gave you the fear of God, not the awe, not the radical amazement, not the thing that was supposed to draw you toward wisdom, but the specific dread of a God who was watching your thoughts and keeping a record of your infractions, what did that feel like? Not the theological answer, not the explanation your pastor would have given, not the doctrine. What it felt like in your body, in the night. When you were a child, lying awake trying to inventory your thoughts for sin, or a teenager making bargains with something you couldn't see, or an adult who left the faith and found that the anxiety didn't leave when the theology did. Leave it in the comments. Because I have a feeling that what gets written below this video is going to tell a story that none of the seminaries were tracking when they decided to teach Jerome's Latin instead of Proverbs Hebrew. One more thing before I go. The Spinoza Forever Library. 5 volumes covering the questions this channel keeps returning to, the history behind the faith you were handed, and what the scholarship has actually found, is linked in the description below and pinned in the first comment. It is the deeper version of this kind of investigation in a form you can read at your own pace. The link is in the pinned comment.